Hey guys, today I want to talk about an issue that I've been negligent about until I discussed it with some speedrunners and friends. If you haven't guessed it yet, I'm talking about DPS overlays. Here, I want to discuss potential issues regarding the overlay, and how I think it is best used for almost any situation. If you're a new player that has no idea what I'm talking about, the DPS overlay is a mod that you can download from the Nexus mod site, if you do not get distracted by content that I cannot put on YouTube for the sake of my channel's longevity. From this mod, you are able to see the damage done from each individual player, as well as yourself, and then calculate your average DPS. As a former MMORPG player and raider, I have seen some of the issues, as well as been victim of improper usage of DPS parsers and related overlays. These issues usually stem from using these tools too early on, and also taking these numbers in a vacuum. Let's take a look at what happens when you start observing DPS numbers early on. As a newer player, you will be constantly changing and upgrading gear, to the point that seeing changes in DPS is quite normal. There is absolutely no way to track your DPS output at this point, as you'll be seeing leaps and drops as you learn your weapon and the game's mechanics. Weapons, such as the dual blades with a lower skill floor, will naturally give higher DPS numbers, whereas weapons with higher skill floors, such as Charge Blade, will be giving much lower DPS numbers in the beginning. Does this make the dual blades a better weapon than the Charge Blade? Not necessarily. I have seen very amazing plays from both weapons for different matchups, and these small changes cannot necessarily be reflected in the DPS overlays numbers. Aside from that, using DPS overlays provide a shortcut to the final damage values, while providing little explanation on different armor skills that contribute to these values. This creates a weak foundation to understanding the game, and thus creating a lack of knowledge, creating suboptimal builds later on when there are more armor skills to juggle and decorations to farm. For example, creating an over-reliance on using DPS overlays will make players overlook important skills for learning the game, such as Divine Blessing, and skills such as tool maintenance in favor of inefficient skills like attack boost, or putting on skills such as resentment rather than peak performance on non-sappy Jiva builds. Another common misuse of DPS overlays is misinterpreting the data. Throughout the chaos of multiplayer fights, a lot of unforeseen circumstances can change the DPS of players. May it be a flinch happening at the wrong time, forcing greatsword players to miss a high damage punish, or a single cart, which can bring down the damage drastically. This happens often when I raided back in MMORPGs as well, as certain mechanics can interfere with DPS uptime. These numbers are not a reflection of a player, but rather a reflection of the circumstances that occurred over the course of a single run. Players who run DPS overlays should never harass another player for doing less damage, even if the numbers are truly abysmal. For players who cannot understand the MMORPG reference to DPS parsers, I can provide another example of knowledge of damage dealt being used as a basis for harassment. If you know, you know. As someone who has been on both ends of this misuse of damage overlays, I can wholeheartedly denounce the harassment of other players for doing low damage. No one really enjoys hearing about it, or cares about how you do more damage than them. Surprisingly enough, a lot of players that end up using DPS overlays are average Joes, looking for a benchmark of their own performance against other players. Others, like me, enjoy seeing DPS because we like to have our ego being broken down after we realize that we're not doing as hot as we think. Since most of the players in multiplayer are usually not full sweat speedrunning, players should realize that comparing themselves to other players creates a slightly skewed stat line. What I learned was doing better than the player I compare myself to does not necessarily make me a good player. Speedrunners often lament about being doubted and being called a cheater while playing multiplayer, as DPS overlays have made slightly above average players arrogant. Some of you may know what I mean when I say, these players are frogs in a well, and there are horizons that they have yet to see. Despite having played this game for way more hours than a normal human should ever have over the past year, I am continuously astounded by players showing me up with my own weapon. Okay, so I think by now, I have made my point that DPS overlays can be misused and abused. And the misuse can create toxic behaviors and bad habits over a long period of time. I'm going to switch it up and talk about what I think is the best way to use the DPS overlay. Naturally, I don't mind if you have a differing opinion on how it should be used. And if you do, feel free to tell me in the comments below. Personally, I think the best way to use the DPS overlay is to turn off all allied damage and only show your own, or use it in a solo run after reaching endgame. This way, the only numbers that show up is the one thing that actually matters. Players will be able to compare their damage across different builds and their performance with them to make informed adjustments, while being able to observe their improvement across a period of time. I understand that most players who have the DPS overlays do not abuse the mod, but I hope that this video serves as a cautionary warning when using similar softwares too early or improperly for different games. Overall, I think that the addition of these metrics provide valuable feedback when it is used properly. Occasionally, I even see in my comments how players using the overlay can get an ego check when seeing how an experienced player outperforms them in damage. Remember that, as this is merely a tool, it is our responsibility to use it correctly. Feel free to share with me your worst DPS overlay abuse story in the comments below, or if you agree with my thoughts or not. I wish everyone a pleasant hunt, and I'll see you next time.